Thank you for having me. My name is David Altman. I am originally from Uruguay, but I live in Chile for quite a time, a bit of time, about 18 years. Uh, and I am a political scientist. I am a political comparativist, and within this area of research and teaching, I concentrate on democracy, how to measure democracy, uh, and I'm studying democratic innovations, democratic different aspects of democracy theory and empirics, right? So I'm the chair of the Political Science Institute at the Catholic University of Chile, which is one of the traditional universities of this country. And that's it, basically, to start with.
Perfect. Okay, so the citizens of Chile voted for a new constitution last Sunday on the 25th of October after months of protests. And the protests were started by a young group of students, as I recall, if it's right, I think, and then had very quickly become a social movement. So I think the problem here does not seem to be one from the youth generation, but also from a lot of citizens in Chile. So could you tell us what the main problems are with the current constitution and how the plebiscite came to be?
Well, that's a very big question. Let's say that, let me start with the transition to democracy in 1990. You know, in 1990, Chile was one of the last countries in Latin America to transit to democracy. And the military regime approved a constitution in 1980, which was later reformed a little bit in 1989, and then transition came. This transition to democracy was the fruit of a long period of negotiations between the government and the opposition. And one of the characteristics of this transition was exactly the constitution that we inherit from Pinochet and the military regime. This constitution was basically based on certain institutional designs that really were avoiding change virtually at any price. It was extremely hard to change or to reform the constitution with the constitution that it's currently in place in Chile. So, for instance, we have what it was called designated senators. A portion of the Senate, the second chamber, was not elected by the people directly, so they were appointed to those works, and extremely high quorums for constitutional reform. An electoral system was perceived as quite unfair and very little representative of the diversity of Chilean society. There were a series of institutions that produce a lot of frustration in the citizenship at large. Adding to that situation, we have certain designs that really weren't very how can I say, didn't help much democracy. For instance, how the electoral roll was constructed. And Chile had a very extremely weird combination of institutions where registration was a right, but once you were registered in the electoral roll, you had an obligation to vote, which is a quite perverse system of registry and voting in any country in the world, in any democracy. So what we witness a constant decrease in the amount of participation, because obviously who would voluntarily accept an obligation? It doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. So I would say since the early 2010s, we have seen as different demonstrations, particularly from the student movement, requesting not only more funds for public education, but also political changes. And this little uprisings, let's put it little, but enough strong to produce a relatively wave in the public opinion, were fertilizing the soil for what we saw, and you mentioned briefly, uh, at least from October 2019. The all this, the constitution plus the electoral system plus the electoral registration, everything was a particular and explosive combination, an explosive cocktail that was was ready to explode at any time, at any crisis. If you add to that the political system, due to the electoral system that was ingrained in the constitution, produced that a party system that was not sensible enough or flexible enough to catch on with citizen perceptions and citizen desires. So you have political parties that were uprooted from society. You have an electoral system that didn't represent exactly what the society wanted. You have very high degrees of frustration, and we have to add maybe the last aspect or dimension that I want to mention is the fact that Chile has been an example of economic development. Chile has been underlined and pointed out as one of the most successful stories in Latin America in terms of economic development. You know, privatization of social welfare. For instance, in some regard, Chile was considered a guinea pig in terms of privatization of pensions, right? Before Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, Chile was the experiment of the Western Hemisphere. And it worked partially based on some criteria that these international financial institutions had at that time. And it's absolutely undeniable that economic development has been important, at least on the national terms, which simultaneously generated an expansion of low middle class sectors of society for the first time in many generations, that they were able to access to certain services and goods that weren't before. But then frustration came along with that, in terms of they were with huge debts that they had to pay eventually to go to the university, to go to a good health provider, to, you know, so frustration and this uprootedness of the political system, detachment of the political elites from what was going on, you know, here on the streets, and simultaneously with the frustration of this huge economic development, it was again was an explosive cocktail that exploded on October 18th last year. And yeah, that was right. It was the trigger of that uprising was an attempt of an increase of 30 Chilean pesos of the subway price, which is not much. We are talking about at that time they were about 7 American cents. But this movement had the ability to behave as an expansion wave. And then you saw what you saw on TV and every news in the world about the uprising that involved a lot of violence from the police and the armed forces, curfews. You know, it was pretty violent in some instances. And here we are. The situation by early November was really unbearable. We didn't know what's going to happen at that time, until the political parties agreed on November 15 to make an arrangement, an agreement among themselves, with the exception of 1 or 2 marginal political parties, in terms of deciding and asking the citizenry whether they really want a new constitution, and in case they wanted a new constitution, who is going to be in charge of drafting this new constitution. So basically, This last Sunday, we had two plebiscites, one on whether we wanted to change the constitution, and the second was about who's going to be in charge of drafting that new constitution. Both questions were highly, well, the majorities were huge, 80% against 20, more or less, with a participation of about a little bit above of 50% of those in the electoral registries, which, considering that we are in, in a very obvious situation of the COVID-19 and the pandemic, it's relatively, I don't know if whether I should say good or bad, I don't know, but in term at least was more than during the last presidential election, the turnout.
Okay.
So here we are, waiting for the April elections, for those who are gonna be the conventionals, the constitutional conventionals of this assembly, who is in charge of drafting the new constitution. And eventually in a year and something, we're gonna have an exit plebiscite or referendum on whether we accept the new draft constitution or we stick with what we have these days.
Mm. So originally the plebiscite was supposed to happen in April, I think, but due to the pandemic, it was postponed to October, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So how do you or did you see any changes in the protesting during the pandemic, or how did the protesters react to the postponing? Have you seen any changes in that?
No, I think that basically the broad majority of the society accepted that it was impossible to have a popular vote on April. We were at the apex of the pandemic at that time. I don't know, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but 300 or more people were dying a day. I mean, we were talking about thousands of people sick with the virus. So it was virtually impossible. Now the situation still it's pretty terrible, but it's more control, and we know more about the virus and how to avoid, mistakes of contagious people and things like that. So no, I think that more or less everyone agreed, or the large majority agreed, that it was impossible and it has to be deferred. Yeah. Then you have a couple of experiences, even here in the neighborhood, about national elections, and they weren't so terrible. So they were learning about that. And that's why the electoral authorities and the government and most political parties agreed to delay the vote for about half a year or something.
Okay. So for the new constitution, what do the Chilean people want or expect from the new constitution? So what needs to change?
Well, there are several things, and of course, when it's virtually impossible to talk about what the Chilean people want. I mean, the Chilean people involves the military that were part of the dictatorship government, involves the elites that enrich themselves during this neoliberal time, involves I don't know, all the sectors and different groups of society. So I would say that these 80% represents a really important feeling of providing the most important legislation, which is the constitution, with some sort of legitimacy. Chile never in its history had a constitutional voted directly by the people in a democratic environment. So first of all, it's about legitimacy. Second, I would say that there is a very important amount of willingness to change a little bit the DNA of the state and its relationship with economics, in terms of there should be some basic rights instead of goods. Most of the time here you are involved in a situation where you buy and you sell goods that in many parts of Europe it's virtually impossible even to explain that the public health you have to pay. I mean, tertiary education, pensions are absolutely poor. So here it's another part of the problem, which many individuals believe that changing the constitution, we're going to solve most of these problems. So we are at the risk of generating a very party of different frustrations, because sometimes you can't by design the constitution say, okay, pensions now from here on are going to be beautiful, and healthcare is going to be fantastic, and education is going to be competitive and universal. Well, it's really hard to make all these demands, to materialize all these demands in the constitution. You can say, yeah, well, the state would try to make all these rights universal as much as possible, but there are other forces playing. So my major concern is about these potential frustrations that gonna be evident once the convention start to works.
Mm. So
But yeah, basically I would say that most citizens would agree that we need to change a little bit the DNA of the state in terms of how we citizens relate with the state, and basic services such as pensions, healthcare, education, environment, gender equality, etc., etc. Some of these are constitutionally tackable. I mean, you can catch them through legislation, but many of them not.
mm. Okay, so as you said, they also voted for a citizens' assembly that is going to work out the new constitution. So what are the next steps exactly, and how will this process look like? So you said people can be elected for the convention. So who can be elected? What is the process there?
Well, the process is that until January, we have all the candidates have time to register themselves as a potential candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Political parties have the right to present. We're going to use exactly the same electoral system that we use for the legislature. So this convention is going to be integrated by 155 members. The discussion today is about the native Chileans, whether they're gonna be a specific portion of these 155 members, or they're gonna be added to these 155 people. So that there is a discussion that is not solved yet. One of the very interesting aspects of this convention is that it's going to be gender even. So it's going to have exactly the same amount of men and women, probably with one or two, depending on some mathematical combinations, but basically it's going to be 50-50. And then independent individuals would be able to present themselves in their respective districts if they have the support of certain percentage of the signatures of the citizens that voted in the last election at the legislature in that particular district. So basically you have political parties, the same political parties that are considered part of the problem, and some individuals who are going to run as independent candidates for this convention. But, the degree of independence of citizens, we can discuss very long about that. Everyone has interest and wishes and dreams and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically once all the names are the whole list is going to be completed by mid-January. We're going to have the elections in April. I don't remember exactly which day, but it's going to be April next year.
Okay, so will they figure out a working process for that after the elections, or is there already a plan on how to proceed after everyone's elected?
Well, no, they have to convene, and they're gonna set their own rules during the convention itself. It's agreed that the draft has to be approved by 2/3 within that convention. There is a wall of 2/3.
Mm-hmm.
So it's gonna be a lot of discussion whether how to achieve these 2/3 in the Constitutional Convention. There are more open questions than certainties at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the convention is going to be a sovereign organ that will determine its functioning.
Okay. So if you say that the political parties can also present people to be elected in the vote in April,
Yes.
do you think it's a good procedure? Because I know that in Europe, for citizens assembly, for example, they use a lot, so people are randomly chosen. What do you say to the process of choosing people to be elected?
Well, there are very few examples of sortition in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, very few. I count the unconstitutional assemblies.
No, just I mean for citizens assemblies.
Well, this is different. This is a constitutional convention. This is
Yeah. Okay.
as that happens in every democracy. It's not subnational. It's not a neighborhood level. It's not a provincial level. We're talking about Chile as a country. It's going to reform its constitution, and has chosen to choose for a constitutional convention. I'm personally very fond of sortition. I think it's the most democratic way to go. But I'm an extreme minority, not only here, but also in the academic world, I would say too. Sortition is good, but it has its problems too. We can point out the British Columbia Citizens Assembly that was basically set up for changing the electoral regime of the province of British Columbia in Canada about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And then we don't have many more experiences with citizens assemblies chosen by sortition. Again, I'm very fond because it provides everyone with the same probability of being member of that convention. Because otherwise you need resources, power, money, influence, time, which is not evenly distributed in our societies. It's not distributed in Germany. It's even less well distributed in Chile. So yeah, we have a lot of problems. Now, whether I am fond of political parties to present their candidates, of course, yes. There is no democracy on earth, no democracy where democracy works in the absence of political parties. We need political parties. There is no way out of political parties, at least as long as we are playing this representative game. So maybe we need different political parties, or reform the existing political parties, or improve their functioning. Yeah, that's for sure, no questions asked. But political parties, we need political parties. I'm very skeptic about the independence of citizens. Probably I'm going against many of the eventual people that we will see this video, but I'm a little bit afraid of this sort of naivete of believing that people are just wonderful, positive, full of good moods or things like that. Yeah, no, I don't buy very much the idea of this idea of a voluntaristic world where just the good people are gonna act. We know the bad people, and we know that they are as rational and selfish as the good people too. So yeah.
Okay, so you're a little bit skeptical on the outcome of the whole convention, or on the
Yes, I am. I am skeptical, and I'm a little bit nervous too, because every every time that you make this type of important changes, many there you can see neutralizing good forces at the same time. Uh, Sometimes the resultant of this process could open could lead to the failure due to the fact that they can't cooperate. So sometimes those who have economic development as their north, and those who want environmental protection as their north, I mean, they are valuable goods, and sometimes they clash among themselves, and that's evident. So yeah, I'm skeptical about the whole process. I'm optimistic. I mean, by nature, I'm an optimistic guy, and I wish the best. But we are just beginning a very long process that has a lot of challenges in the way, and I can't simply ignore them. I can't tell you, oh yeah, Chile started a new era. Well, maybe yes, maybe not.
Mm, yeah, perfect. So thank you very much for your time. I think we have had a lovely talk about this. Thank you very much for your interesting insights on this.